Okay, so just a brief discussion of sub-Saharan Africa to wrap up decolonization. We discussed how, in India, in Vietnam, in Algeria, for example, you do have some pretty upfront, in many cases, violent confrontations to end periods of colonization. But you're going to see in sub-Saharan Africa, it's relatively smooth, a little bit more peaceful. Part of that is because starting in 1957, Great Britain establishes the British Commonwealth of Nations, which you see represented below in this map. So the British Commonwealth of Nations was all these former colonies of Great Britain. And what happens with the Commonwealth is that all these former colonies achieve independence with very little or no bloodshed, and then they enter into this sort of loose association with Great Britain. So, they're still affiliated with Great Britain, but they're not directly ruled by it. So this was a relatively peaceful way that you see a lot of these countries in Africa break off from Great Britain. Now, the one exception to the rule from Great Britain is the Mau Mau Society. They were Kenyan, and they were a group of terrorists and freedom fighters who actually fought in a violent way to end English control of Kenya. And the interesting sort of side note to that is actually Barack Obama's grandfather was one of the Mau Mau fighters against England and was imprisoned. So I guess what's important, AP exam-wise, if there was a multiple choice question with an accept, it'd be important to consider sub-Saharan Africa as kind of the more smooth, a smooth area in terms of decolonization. With that in mind, something similar happens in France. In 1958, you have President Charles de Gaulle basically giving Black Africa or sub-Saharan French Africa two different options. One of their options is to just completely break away from France, or their other option is to become independent but still be part of a commonwealth to France. And all but one of the former French colonies actually choose to still be associated with France, so be part of that commonwealth. And so the reason why that's important is because you still have kind of a lingering cultural imperialism, because these countries that remain as part of a commonwealth are still very much influenced by France. You actually see France kind of continuing its mission to so-called, quote-unquote, civilize these nations in sub-Saharan Africa. And also France is interested, of course, in selling its industrial goods and raw materials, and also, it can invest in these countries, and it also, when it has an affiliation with these African countries, it can provide temporary jobs for teachers or engineers, for example. So basically, it is a relatively peaceful way for these countries to achieve independence, but at the same time, they're not completely emancipated, they're not completely independent from France because this continued economic and cultural relationship exists. Last but not least, now this is not decolonization, I'm just keeping it in the same video just to, put it all in the same place. We'll return to the Balkans. We remember these as a really heated region going into World War I. We also see this as a sort of dramatic hotspot after sort of in the later years of World War II and in the Cold War. You may remember earlier in this unit, we talked about how Yugoslavia actually was sort of an exception to the rule in the Eastern Bloc because Yugoslavia actually successfully repelled the Nazis without the USSR's help. So because of that, their economy developed without Soviet influence. It was sort of a mixed communist/capitalist economy. So in a lot of ways, Yugoslavia was living in relative harmony until about 1980, when President Josip Tito died, and then things start to fall apart. And the reason why that is because the president in 1990, Slobodan Milosevic, wants to basically make all of Yugoslavia be dominated by Serbs. And I want to show you a map to give you a sense of why that matters. So this is the former Yugoslavia, and you can see how diverse it is in terms of ethnicity. So everything represented in blue is Serb. So what President Milosevic wanted to do was to make all of Yugoslavia dominated by Serbs. But look at all the other ethnic minorities that exist within this huge territory. So this is going to make a lot of people unhappy in particular, and I'll go back to the text, but actually I think the map is helpful to look at when we understand how this civil war breaks out. So basically, when Milosevic tries to make Serbia, Yugoslavia dominated by Serbs, first Croatia and Slovenia respond by declaring independence, and they actually successfully fight off Serbia. So the story of Croatia and Slovenia is a little bit happier. But then when we move down to Bosnia-Herzegovina, they also declare their independence in March of 1992, but this is much more bloody, because you can see that the other minority population in Bosnia-Herzegovina is Muslim. And so what's happening actually is that Bosnian Serbs who are living in Bosnia-Herzegovina don't want to live in a region that's dominated by Muslims. And so they start to bring in all these military operations into Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they're assisted by Serbs, and they're assisted by, by members of the Yugoslav Federal Army. So basically, the Bosnian Serbs end up attacking Sarajevo, right here, the capital of Bosnia, and they start to launch what they call ethnic cleansing. We previously have referred to it as genocide, right? But basically what the Bosnian Serbs are trying to do is to liquidate or remove all Muslims from Bosnia. And they're doing this by shelling cities and confiscating or destroying houses, conducting gang rape, expelling people from the country, murdering people from the country. And during this period of ethnic cleansing, hundreds of thousands of Bosnians are killed, Muslims in particular, right? To try to kind of eliminate this minority population completely and establish a Serbian majority. The UN decides to step in and stop this. Let me just go back so you can see, if you want, you can pause it to get a moment to write this stuff down. But ultimately, the sort of reaction to that is the UN steps in and they come to an agreement in Dayton, Ohio in 1995 called the Dayton Agreements. And what they established there is to divide Bosnia into two different states, one Muslim and one Serb. What this does is it makes the Bosnian Serbs really unhappy because they wanted to join a greater Serbia, right? They actually want what President Milosevic wanted, right, to have a Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. So by dividing Bosnia-Herzegovina into Muslim and Serb, they don't like that. So they're really disappointed by the U.S. and NATO. And also the U.S. And NATO actually send troops into Bosnia and Herzegovina to enforce the Dayton Agreement so the Bosnian Serbs can't get their way. And then last but not least, we have the Kosovo crisis. And Kosovo is here. It's a region, it's a portion of Serbia. And as we can see, the majority population of Serbia is actually Albanian. And so what happens here is that President Milosevic wants to launch ethnic cleansing of all the ethnic Albanians. This map actually shows us that Albania had previously occupied Kosovo, which is why there's so many Albanians there. And so by trying to ethnically cleanse Kosovo, again, we have NATO step in, and this time NATO, led by the US, actually bombs Serbia to make them stop the ethnic cleansing. But nonetheless, this the Kosovo crisis was just an example of the continued religious and ethnic tension that exists in the Balkan region, and this is one of the major international crises that President Clinton faces very early in his term. So by the year 2000, Milosevic is removed from power, and he ends up going to prison for war crimes, but he dies in prison before he's ever convicted of anything in 2006. And then the very last vestige of Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia, Montenegro, which you see here, votes for independence in 2006. So basically all of what used to be Yugoslavia is now broken up into these independent regions. Okay, very quickly returning to Western Europe just to get a sense of where they are post-Cold War. And then I'm going to give you a little European unity unit that you can also look over the notes and watch some videos that another teacher put together over the weekend so that we can have a really full picture of everything quickly before we do our review. So we know that Germany is reunified as of 1990, right? But what's important to know is that at first it wasn't completely smooth. The East Germans actually want to try to maintain socialism for a little while. They call their economy the third way, so sort of an alternative to all-out Soviet communism, but also an alternative to capitalism. It's sort of a socialist economy that they want to continue. But what happens is, because the East German economy is weak, it gets absorbed into West Germany. And when the economies merge, what you see is that the West Germans actually have to pay really heavy taxes to rebuild the East. And then the East Germans, even though they're actually reaping a lot of the benefits by the West Germans using their tax dollars to essentially build up their economy, they kind of feel like second-class citizens because they don't really have as much say in the future of their country as their economy is being repaired. So they do benefit from the economic recovery, but at the same time they don't get that much of a say in it. But the important takeaway from Germany is that after they unify, despite the fact that it was very expensive, Germany emerges as an economic powerhouse, which it still is today. You see Britain and France sort of a little reluctant to European unity in the Britain in the 1980s. With the formation of the EU, at first Britain was sort of reluctant to join the EU. It kind of felt like it was choosing between unity or nationalism, right? Would it give up some of its British identity? And so Britain does join the EU, but it does not take part in its monetary union. So as we know, Britain still is not on the euro. So this is an important way that Britain tries to maintain some of its independence. And then France actually was resistant to NATO in the 1960s. So even though they were part of NATO in the 1960s, they were kind of afraid that America was going to dominate European politics, so they threatened to withdraw from NATO, which you're going to see in the independent videos that I'll post for you over the weekend. Okay. A couple other things that sort of are disrupting the peace in Europe at this time. There are going to be some terrorist organizations that are emerging. Two important ones to be familiar with. The Irish Republican Army, which we talked about a little bit during the period of Irish independence. So they actually, they want Northern Ireland, which we know remained part of Great Britain. You can actually see this is a map of Basque, but you can see Northern Ireland here. Remember, they stay Great Britain because they are Protestant, right? Whereas Southern Ireland breaks off, becomes independent, it's Catholic. And the Irish Republican Army, they actually go to England, they terrorize a bunch of their cities, and they demand that Northern Ireland be returned. So, definitely an example of instability in Europe. And then you have the ETA, which was a Basque separatist organization. So this is the Basque region of Spain. Basically, they want Basque to be independent from Spain, and so they do lots and lots of acts of terror, car bombs, very frequently, just to, again, try to fight for independence. So it shows the lack of stability in some places. And then another example of the lack of stability is sort of defining what makes a European, because in post-colonial Europe, we of course have pattern waves of immigration. In particular, we have guest workers, people who are coming in from other countries, ultimately to find jobs in Europe. A lot of this is because the post-colonial economies sort of broke down in these former colonized countries. So, for example, you'd have North Africans actually emigrate to France to try to find jobs. You'd have Turkish immigrants going to places like Germany and Austria to try to find jobs because they just didn't have jobs in their home countries. But nonetheless, a lot of right-wing nationalists within Europe really opposed these patterns of migration. So again, you have a source of tension is ultimately, what makes a European and how nationalism continues to be a prominent theme in these discussions. Two figures we should know, and I just love this picture here of Jean-Marie Le Pen. He is a good example of a French opponent of immigration, and also he did not want France to integrate into the European Union. So his face really, if you remember this face, you get a sense of, okay, no immigrants, don't join the UN, right? Or not the UN, sorry, don't join the EU. I mean, that face kind of says it all. And then in Austria, you have Jörg Haider, who led the right-wing Austrian Freedom Party, which was also really opposed to immigration. And his party actually becomes the ruling coalition government in 2000, And because of that, the EU actually demands that he steps down. So this is just a good little wrap up that gives you a sense of, even though, of course, Europe has come a long way since the Cold War, there still are definite points of tension. I would say Yugoslavia is a really good one to focus on, Israel as well, but this is a good one as well. Okay?